March 1945. Deep beneath the streets of London, in the heavily fortified war rooms. Winston Churchill stands hunched over a large strategic map of Germany, the harsh overhead lighting casting deep shadows across the detailed terrain markings. His eyes are fixed with intense concentration on the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier standing between the advancing Allied armies and the industrial heart of the crumbling Third Reich. For weeks now, long, frustrating weeks, he's been waiting with growing impatience, waiting for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to finally launch Operation Plunder, the most meticulously planned, carefully choreographed river crossing in the entire history of military operations. 1 million men assembled and ready, 4,000 artillery pieces positioned along the western bank, months upon months of detailed, painstaking preparation. But then a telegram arrives from Supreme Headquarters. An aide rushes it into the war room. Churchill tears open the envelope quickly, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency, and his face goes absolutely white, drained of color. The message is from General George S. Patton, dated 24 hours earlier. The text contains words that will echo through military history for generations to come. Quote 0. Patton had done it in complete, total silence, in absolute darkness, while Montgomery was still methodically, carefully moving his chess pieces into their assigned positions. Patton had already won the game, already claimed victory, and what Churchill said next would reveal the brutal, unvarnished truth about two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, two competing philosophies of how battles should be fought. To truly understand what happened on the Rhine, you have to understand the two men who defined this moment: Bernard Law Montgomery and George Smith Patton, Jr. They were both generals of considerable reputation and experience. They both wore Allied uniforms and fought for the same cause. But that's where the similarities ended completely and utterly. Montgomery was the living, breathing portrait of British military tradition, methodical, cautious, aristocratic in bearing and manner. He believed deeply, fundamentally in the set-piece battle, the kind of engagement where every variable is controlled, every risk carefully calculated and accounted for, every supply line secured and verified before a single shot is fired. He'd won at El Alamein that way, methodically grinding Rommel into the desert sand with superior numbers and relentless, patient preparation. To Montgomery, warfare was a science, a mathematical equation to be solved. You don't improvise on the battlefield. You don't take unnecessary chances. You plan with precision, you prepare with thoroughness, and when everything is absolutely perfect, you strike with overwhelming, irresistible force. His soldiers called him Monty with affection. His critics called him slow, overly cautious. Patton was the opposite in every way that mattered, in every way that counted. Born in California, raised on romanticized tales of Confederate cavalry charges, he was a man fundamentally out of his proper time. A 19th century warrior somehow trapped in a 20th century war. He wore ivory-handled revolvers prominently on his belt. He quoted ancient battles and classical warfare from memory. He believed passionately in speed, shock, and the killing power of pure audacity. To Patton, war wasn't a science to be calculated. It was an art to be practiced, and the canvas was painted in blood and gasoline. He'd raced across France faster than any army in modern military history, his tanks consistently outrunning their own supply lines, living off captured German fuel depots and supply dumps. His philosophy was simple, brutal, and effective. A good plan, violently executed now, is infinitely better than a perfect plan executed next week. His soldiers worshipped him like a demigod. His superiors feared him and his unpredictability, and Montgomery despised him completely. The feeling was entirely, thoroughly mutual. Patton called Montgomery. Montgomery called Patton with barely concealed contempt. But beneath the personal insults and professional rivalry was something deeper, something more profound and consequential, a fundamental, irreconcilable disagreement about how wars should be fought and how many lives should be spent waiting for perfect conditions. By March 1945, that disagreement was about to be tested on the most dangerous, most heavily defended river in Europe. The Rhine wasn't just another obstacle to overcome. It was the gateway to Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. the last natural defense before the Allied armies could pour across and end the war. Hitler had personally ordered every bridge destroyed without exception, every crossing point heavily fortified, every meter of the eastern bank turned into a killing zone. Both Montgomery and Patton knew that crossing the Rhine would define their military legacies forever. One of them would do it with the weight of an empire behind him. The other would do it with nothing but audacity and the cover of darkness. Operation Plunder. Even the name itself sounded ponderous, bureaucratic, methodical, like something designed by committee rather than conceived by a warrior. And in a very real way, it was. Montgomery had been planning his Rhine crossing since January, not days, not weeks, months of detailed preparation. He envisioned it as the crowning achievement of his distinguished military career. A river crossing so massive, so perfectly orchestrated and executed that it would make the D-Day landings look like a reconnaissance mission. The numbers involved were staggering, almost unbelievable in scale. 1 million men from the British Second Army and the American Ninth Army. 4,000 artillery pieces that would turn the eastern bank of the Rhine into a cratered moonscape before a single soldier set foot in an assault boat. 30,000 soldiers to be dropped by parachute and glider behind German lines to secure the bridgehead. 3,000 bombers to pulverize every German position within 10 miles of the crossing sites. Montgomery wanted total supremacy, total control over every aspect. Zero risk, zero chance of failure. And to achieve that perfect state of preparation, he needed time. Time to stockpile ammunition until there were literal mountains of shells stacked in dumps along the river. Time to rehearse every movement until his soldiers could execute the crossing in their sleep. Time to construct the massive bridges that would carry his armor deep into the heart of Germany. Churchill watched this seemingly endless buildup with growing impatience and mounting frustration. Every day of delay was another day for the Germans to reinforce their positions. Another day for Hitler to move divisions east to face the advancing Soviets. Another day that the war dragged on, costing lives and resources. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was equally frustrated with the pace. He'd given Montgomery the Rhine crossing as a concession to British pride and prestige, but he was beginning to seriously wonder if Monty would ever actually cross the river. By mid-March, the waiting had become almost unbearable for everyone involved. Montgomery's target date was firmly set for March 24th. Everything would be ready by then, he assured everyone. Every gun in its assigned place, every boat accounted for and tested, every conceivable risk eliminated. The buildup was visible from miles away, impossible to hide. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over daily, photographing the massive supply dumps, the extensive artillery parks, the sprawling camps filled with thousands of soldiers. There was no element of surprise whatsoever. The Germans knew exactly where Montgomery intended to cross, and they were reinforcing those positions with every man they could possibly spare from other sectors. Montgomery didn't care about the lack of surprise. He believed that tactical surprise was overrated and unnecessary. What mattered was overwhelming, crushing force. When he finally attacked, the Germans would be obliterated under the sheer weight of British and American firepower, regardless of how well prepared they were. But 200 miles to the south, George Patton wasn't waiting for anything. He was watching the Rhine with the patient, calculating eyes of a predator, and he'd found a critical weakness in the German defensive line that Montgomery's staff planners had completely overlooked: Oppenheim. A small, relatively insignificant German town on the east bank of the Rhine, located midway between Mainz and Worms. To Montgomery's staff officers, it was strategically irrelevant, too far south to matter in the grand scheme of Operation Plunder. To Patton, it was everything, because Oppenheim was lightly defended, barely garrisoned. The Germans had pulled most of their forces north to face Montgomery's obvious, impossible-to-hide buildup. They never imagined that an American general would be crazy enough, bold enough to attempt a major crossing without massive preparation, without air support, without the thundering artillery barrage that announced every major operation. Patton imagined exactly that. On the night of March 22nd, while Montgomery was holding yet another detailed briefing session with his commanders, carefully reviewing plans, Patton struck. No preliminary bombardment to announce his intentions. No aerial bombing to soften defenses, no smoke screen to conceal movement. Just silence and darkness, and 6 battalions of American infantry quietly climbing into assault boats on the western bank of the Rhine. The river was 300 yards wide at Oppenheim, fast-moving, cold, defended by German machine gun nests and artillery positions on the high ground beyond. Any sane, rational military planner would have said it was suicide without proper supporting fire. Patton's men went anyway, without hesitation. They paddled across in the darkness, silently. The only sounds were the gentle slap of water against wood and the distant rumble of Montgomery's supply trucks 200 miles to the north. German sentries heard nothing unusual until the first boats grounded on the eastern shore. By then it was far too late to react effectively. Patton's infantry stormed the German positions with bayonets and grenades, fighting in total silence to maintain the precious element of surprise. Within 2 hours, they'd secured a substantial bridgehead. Within 6 hours, combat engineers were constructing a pontoon bridge. Within 12 hours, Patton's tanks were rolling across the Rhine into the heart of Germany, and Patton, standing on the western bank watching his forces cross, did something that would become absolute legend. He walked to the middle of the pontoon bridge, unzipped his trousers, and urinated into the Rhine. Then he turned to his assembled staff officers and said with satisfaction, "I've been looking forward to this for a long time." The next morning, he sent his famous telegram to Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters. Without benefit of aerial bombing, ground smoke, artillery preparation, and airborne assistance, the Third Army crossed the Rhine. It was the military equivalent of a middle finger pointed directly at Montgomery. Patton's crossing cost fewer than 40 casualties total. The Germans were so shocked and disoriented by the silent assault that many positions surrendered without firing a single shot. By the time Hitler's headquarters in Berlin realized what had happened, Patton already had 3 full divisions across the river and was driving east at maximum speed. The audacity of it was absolutely breathtaking. While Montgomery was still carefully counting his artillery shells and reviewing his plans, Patton had ripped open the German front and was racing toward Frankfurt. It was everything Montgomery had repeatedly said was impossible, done with a fraction of the resources and in a fraction of the time. The telegram reached London in the early morning hours of March 23rd. Churchill was awake, as he often was during these critical times, pacing the war rooms restlessly. An aide rushed in and handed him the message from Eisenhower's headquarters. Churchill read it once quickly, then again more slowly. Then he began to laugh, not a pleasant, joyful laugh, a bitter, incredulous bark that echoed off the concrete walls. Quote 5. He said to no one in particular. Quote 6. He looked at the map spread before him, at the colored pins marking Montgomery's vast buildup north of the Ruhr, at the massive supply dumps and extensive artillery parks and airfields stuffed with bombers waiting for the order to attack, all of it still waiting, still preparing, while Patton was already across, already advancing. The implications were absolutely devastating. For months, Montgomery had insisted loudly and repeatedly that a Rhine crossing required massive, meticulous preparation, that anything less would be suicidal, that only a fool would attempt it without overwhelming force. And now, Patton had proven him wrong. Not just wrong, but catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong, in the most public way possible. With a handful of assault boats and no artillery preparation, Patton had achieved in one silent night what Montgomery hadn't managed in a month of visible buildup. Churchill's mood darkened considerably as the full implications sank in. He dictated a message to Montgomery, and his words dripped with unmistakable sarcasm. "The enemy had the pleasure of catching us unprepared," he wrote, referring pointedly to Montgomery's continued delay. And then, even more brutally, Quote 8. The British High Command was in complete shock. Montgomery's entire strategic approach had been built on the fundamental premise that the Rhine was impregnable without massive preparation. Patton had just proven that premise false in the most public, most embarrassing way imaginable. When Montgomery finally launched Operation Plunder on March 24th, it was everything he'd promised and more. 1,000 guns firing simultaneously, waves of bombers turning the sky black, paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines in massive numbers. It was magnificent. It was overwhelming. And it was completely, utterly unnecessary, because Patton had already done it with silence, with speed, with pure audacity. The British press tried desperately to spin it as a joint triumph, a combined victory, but everyone knew the actual truth. Montgomery had been upstaged by the general he'd spent years trying to sideline and marginalize, and there was no amount of propaganda that could change that fundamental fact. Churchill's private comments to his inner circle were even more scathing. He told his chiefs of staff that Montgomery had turned the Rhine crossing into a ponderous set piece when it should have been a daring stroke. He openly questioned whether Britain's methodical approach to warfare was suited to modern, mobile conflict. The humiliation was complete and total. Montgomery's crossing succeeded, certainly, but it would forever be remembered as the operation that came second. The operation that was unnecessary. Patton had stolen his thunder, his glory, and his place in military history with one silent night on the Rhine. History remembers the Rhine crossing as Patton's finest hour and Montgomery's greatest humiliation. But it was more than just a clash of oversized egos or a race for personal glory. It was a fundamental lesson in how wars are won and how lives are saved. Montgomery's approach seemed safer on paper, more prudent. Wait until you have overwhelming force. Eliminate every conceivable risk. Strike with such power that victory is mathematically inevitable. But safety has a hidden cost that isn't always apparent. Every day Montgomery waited was another day for the Germans to prepare their defenses, another day for them to reinforce their positions, lay more mines, dig deeper bunkers, position more artillery. When Operation Plunder finally launched, Montgomery's men faced a fully prepared, well-entrenched enemy. The casualties, while acceptable by conventional military standards, were higher than they needed to be. Patton's approach was the complete opposite. Strike fast. Strike unexpectedly. Don't give the enemy time to think, let alone prepare proper defenses. His crossing at Oppenheim caught the Germans completely off guard, totally unprepared. Fewer than 40 casualties to secure a bridgehead that would have cost thousands of lives if the Germans had been ready and waiting. The strategic impact was even more significant than the tactical victory. Patton's breakthrough collapsed the entire German front south of the Ruhr. Within days, his Third Army was racing across Germany, liberating towns and cities faster than the maps could be updated. The German defenders, expecting the main attack to come in the north with Montgomery, were caught completely out of position. Montgomery's attack, when it finally came, met much stiffer resistance precisely because it was expected. The Germans had concentrated their best remaining units in the north. They'd fortified every position with care. They'd prepared for exactly the kind of set-piece battle Montgomery wanted to fight. Churchill understood the lesson. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote about the Rhine crossing with barely concealed frustration at Montgomery's excessive delays. He never explicitly criticized Monty in public. That would have been politically impossible. But his lavish praise for Patton's boldness and initiative spoke volumes. Eisenhower drew his own conclusions from the Rhine crossing. After the Rhine, he increasingly gave the decisive, war-winning missions to American commanders who shared Patton's philosophy of speed and aggression. Montgomery was progressively sidelined, given secondary objectives, while the Americans raced toward Berlin. The lesson wasn't that planning is worthless, or that caution is always wrong. El Alamein had proven that Montgomery's methodical approach could win battles, but the Rhine proved something more important. That in war, timing matters as much as preparation. That surprise can be worth more than numerical superiority. That audacity can save more lives than excessive caution. Patton himself summed it up perfectly in a letter to his wife, written shortly after the crossing. Quote 9. Montgomery never publicly acknowledged that Patton had outmaneuvered him, but he didn't need to. The silence of Patton's crossing, the speed of his breakthrough, the shock in Churchill's voice when he read that telegram. They all spoke louder than any formal admission ever could. In the end, both men crossed the Rhine successfully. Both contributed significantly to Germany's final defeat. But only one of them did it in a way that fundamentally changed how the world thinks about military leadership. Only one of them proved conclusively that sometimes the best plan is the one executed before the enemy expects it. That man was George S. Patton, and the 24 hours he spent crossing the Rhine in silence accomplished more than Montgomery's month of thunder ever could. If this story of audacity versus caution resonated with you, subscribe to WW2 Gear and hit that notification bell. We bring you the untold stories of military leadership and decisive moments every week. Drop a comment and let us know, was Patton's risk justified, or should Montgomery's careful approach have been the model? Thanks for watching WW2 Gear.